They gave me the pen. That is where this story begins, and that is where it ends, and everything in between is the account of what a man does when he is given a tool that was meant to serve the people who gave it to him, and decides, after 9 years of serving them with it, to use it for something else entirely. My name is Ezra. I am 63 years old. I was born enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina in the year 1817, the son of a domestic servant named Clara and a carpenter named James, who built staircases for wealthy Charleston households and who died of fever when I was 7 years old, leaving me and my mother in the household of the Hatch family, where I grew up alongside the Hatch children in the specific proximity that Charleston's domestic arrangements created between enslaved children and the white children they lived among. A proximity that was real in its daily texture and false in every assumption it invited about what the proximity meant. I learned to read at 9, not from the Hatch family, who had no interest in my literacy except as a practical convenience once it existed, but from a woman named Grace who worked in the kitchen and who had been taught decades earlier, in circumstances she described only obliquely, by someone who had understood that literacy passed from one person to another was the most durable form of resistance available in a world where everything else could be taken. Grace taught me with the patience of someone who understood that what she was giving me was not a gift she would see used in her own lifetime, but a tool whose full deployment was a matter of time and circumstance and the specific quality of the person receiving it. I am that person. This is what I did with what she gave me. By the time I was 14, I was copying correspondence for Cornelius Hatch Sr., the father of the man who would eventually own me in the formal legal sense, doing the clerical work that a household with significant legal and commercial affairs required and that my literacy made me suited for. By the time I was 22, when Cornelius Hatch Jr. took over the law practice on Broad Street and took me with it as part of the inheritance, I had been doing legal clerical work for 8 years, and I understood the documents I was copying with a comprehensive practical precision that Hatch Jr., who was 35 and had been practicing law for a decade, had no reason to suspect and no framework for imagining. The law office on Broad Street handled the legal affairs of Charleston's planter class, property transfers, wills, contracts, disputes over land and debts, and the specific commercial arrangements that sustained the cotton and rice economy of the South Carolina Low Country. And manumissions, the legal instruments through which enslaved people were freed, processed through the office with the same professional efficiency as any other legal transaction, the specific paperwork of freedom produced by the same hands, and in the same rooms that produced the specific paperwork of everything else. I handled the manumission documents. I copied them, organized them, filed them, prepared the initial drafts for Hatch's review, managed the correspondence with the notaries and witnesses whose signatures were required for validity. I handled them so regularly and so completely that I knew every element of their construction, every required signature, every procedural requirement, every specific legal language that the courts of South Carolina demanded for a manumission to be recognized as valid by any authority that might subsequently examine it. I knew this the way I knew everything in that office, which was completely, in the specific way that a person knows things they have handled daily for years, in the body as well as the mind, in the hands as well as the understanding. I knew it before I understood what I was going to do with the knowing, and I knew it with a precision that Hatch had never thought to guard against, because guarding against it would have required him to imagine that the person copying his documents was, in any sense that mattered, reading them. He never imagined it. His failure of imagination was my opportunity. And in the autumn of 1848, when they sold my wife, his failure of imagination became the foundation of everything that followed. Her name was Ruth. She was 28 years old in 1848, which meant she was born in 1820, 3 years after me, in the Beaufort district outside Charleston, and had come to the city at age 16 when the plantation where she was born changed hands, and the new owner sold off a portion of the human property to settle the transaction's financing. She came to Charleston as a domestic servant, and she came into my life through the specific mechanisms by which people in our situation came into each other's lives, which were limited and unofficial, and therefore, in the way that things become precious because they are scarce, more carefully tended than the official mechanisms of courtship available to people whose movements were not governed by someone else's calculation of their value. We had been together for 6 years, not married in the legal sense because the law of South Carolina did not recognize marriages between enslaved people, but married in every sense that mattered, which is to say in the sense that we had chosen each other and had organized our lives around that choice and had built, in the specific narrow space available to us, something that functioned as a life and that we had been sustaining for 6 years with the care that things require when they exist in conditions that are not designed for their survival. She worked in the household of a rice merchant named Beaumont on Meeting Street, 3 blocks from the Hatch Law Office, and in the hours between our respective duties, we had managed to build the specific daily fabric of shared life that constitutes a marriage in its actual substance, which is not the ceremony or the legal recognition, but the accumulation of small, ordinary moments across a long period of time, the fabric that is made of 10,000 specific evenings and mornings rather than any single event. Beaumont sold her in October of 1848. Not for any reason connected to Ruth specifically, not as a punishment or a response to any failure of conduct, but as a business transaction, a decision made by a man who had decided to liquidate certain assets and who had included Ruth in the calculation because Ruth was an asset whose value was straightforwardly calculable and whose sale would produce a return that Beaumont found more immediately useful than her continued service. She was sold to a rice planter in the Combahee River District, 40 miles from Charleston, which is not a great distance in ordinary terms and is an absolute distance in the terms that governed our lives, where 40 miles without the freedom to travel them was 40 miles of permanent separation unless something changed the terms. I heard about the sale on a Thursday afternoon. Hatch had dismissed me early from the office due to a social engagement that required the building to itself, and I was crossing Meeting Street toward the quarters where I kept my few belongings, when one of the women who worked in the Beaumont household caught my arm and told me with the urgent directness of someone who knows that what they are saying will hurt, and who has decided that hurting quickly is better than the alternative. Ruth was leaving in the morning. The wagon was already arranged. I walked to the Beaumont house and I found her in the kitchen packing the small bundle of her belongings that a person in her situation was permitted to take. And we had the specific conversation that people have when they know time is short, and there is no adequate language for what the shortness means. She was composed, the way she was always composed, with the specific quality of stillness that I had spent 6 years coming to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its most complete expression, the expression of someone who feels everything so fully that ordinary display would be entirely inadequate to the reality of it. She said, "Find a way." Not a plea, not an instruction, a statement of confidence in the person she was speaking to, a statement that contained within it a complete assessment of what I was capable of and a complete faith that the capability would be applied to this specific problem. She said it the way she said everything important, plainly and with precision, and without the softening that precision sometimes receives from people who confuse softening with kindness. Find a way. I went back to the law office that evening. Hatch was out. I sat at the desk where I had been sitting for 9 years, and I looked at the files in the order I had organized them in, and I thought about what she had said, and I thought about what I knew, and I thought about the specific relationship between what I knew and what the situation required. The situation required a manumission document. I knew how to produce a manumission document. I had produced the initial drafts of dozens of them over 9 years. I knew every element of their construction. I knew which signatures were required, and from whom, and how those signatures were obtained, and how the documents were processed through the notarial system, and how the resulting legal instruments were recognized by the courts of South Carolina as valid evidence of a person's free status. I knew all of this. And sitting in the law office on Broad Street on a Thursday evening in October of 1848, I understood for the first time that knowing all of this was not simply the professional knowledge of a clerk who understood his employer's business. It was the specific technical capability required to do something that had never been done in the Hatch Law Office, and that Cornelius Hatch had never imagined could be done there, which was to produce from within his own office and using his own materials and his own procedural knowledge, a manumission document that the courts of South Carolina would recognize as valid. I opened the file drawer. I removed a sheet of the legal paper that Hatch used for formal instruments. I sat down at the desk. I did not produce anything that night. I was not ready to produce anything that night. What I did was sit with the paper in front of me and think through what producing it would require, not in the general sense, but in the specific procedural sense. Every element, every signature, every seal, every specific language, every potential point of failure, every way in which the document might be examined and by whom, and what examination would reveal, and how to ensure that examination revealed nothing that would identify the document as anything other than what it claimed to be. I thought through all of it. I made no marks on the paper. I put the paper back in the drawer. I went home. I spent the next 6 months preparing. 6 months is a long time to prepare for something, and not long enough for everything the preparation required. I want to describe what the preparation involved, because the description is the account of how the thing was actually possible, which is the part of this story that matters most, the part that is not about what I did, but about how a person in my situation had access to the tools to do it. The first element was signatures. A valid manumission document in South Carolina required specific signatures. The signature of the owner freeing the enslaved person was primary, and I had been copying Hatch's signature on documents for 9 years, not deliberately in preparation for what I was planning. Simply as part of the ordinary work of a legal clerk who prepared initial drafts for review and signature, and who, in doing so, developed through years of practice and observation a comprehensive familiarity with the specific characteristics of the signature he was preparing the space for. I had not been practicing Hatch's signature with any conscious intent. What I had been doing was something more fundamental, which was paying the kind of attention to the specific physical characteristics of a signature that a person pays when they spend years in close proximity to a document. And what 9 years of that attention had given me was a precise and detailed understanding of every element of Hatch's signature, the specific pressure and angle and rhythm of it, the way it began and the way it ended, and the specific irregularities that made it recognizably his rather than anyone else's. I spent 3 months practicing, not on Hatch's paper, which would have created evidence in the office, on scraps of paper I kept in my quarters, cheap paper acquired a few sheets at a time from a stationer near the market, who sold remnants to anyone who came, practicing in the specific hours between midnight and 4 in the morning when I was not expected anywhere, and when the specific quality of concentration that the practice required was available to me without interruption. By the end of 3 months, I could produce Hatch's signature in a form that I was confident would survive the kind of examination that a manumission document received in ordinary use, which was not forensic examination by a specialist, but the practical examination of a court clerk or an official who was looking at a document to verify its apparent legitimacy rather than to challenge it. A kind of examination that was satisfied by a document that looked right, that had the expected elements in the expected form, that presented no visible reason for doubt. The second element was the notarial seal. Valid manumission documents in South Carolina required the seal of a notary, the specific embossed impression that certified the document's execution before an authorized official. Hatch kept his notarial seal in the top right drawer of his desk. I had access to the desk as part of my clerical responsibilities. The seal was used regularly enough that its occasional presence on the desk when I was working at it would attract no attention. What the seal required, in addition to the physical access I had to it, was a document that was complete and ready to receive it, which meant that the seal had to be applied at a specific moment in the document's production when Hatch was not in the office, and when the window of opportunity was sufficient to complete the application without the risk of interruption. I identified 3 such windows in the course of my preparation, 3 regular occasions in Hatch's schedule when his absence from the office was predictable and extended enough to permit the work I needed to do. I noted them, and I planned around them, and I tested them, not by doing anything with the test, but simply by being in the office during those windows, and observing that my presence there was unremarkable and that the time was genuinely available. The third element was the content of the documents themselves. Every manumission document contained specific language describing the enslaved person being freed, their name, their age, their physical description, the name of the freeing owner, and the specific legal language of the manumission itself, the language that transformed a person's legal status from property to free. I knew this language completely, having copied it dozens of times. What I needed for each specific document was the specific information about the specific person it was freeing. Information that was both publicly available in the sense of being observable and practically accessible in the sense of being in my possession or obtainable through the networks available to me. The fourth element was the story. Every freed person needed a plausible account of how they had come to be free, an account consistent with the document and consistent with what the people who might encounter them and question their status would find plausible given what they knew about the person's previous situation. This was the most complicated element of the preparation because it was the most human element, the element that could not be reduced to a technical procedure but required the specific judgment about specific people and specific situations that could only come from knowing the people and the situations well. I spent 6 months preparing all 4 elements simultaneously, advancing each one in parallel with the others, building toward the moment when all 4 would be ready for the first document. That first document was for Ruth. I produced Ruth's manumission document on a Thursday morning in April of 1849, 6 months after she had been sold to the Combahee River District. Thursday was one of the 3 windows I had identified, the morning of Hatch's regular meeting with a client in the lower part of the city. A meeting that consistently lasted between 2 and 3 hours and during which the office was mine alone. I arrived at the office at my usual time. I performed my usual morning work, organizing the correspondence and preparing the day's filing, moving through the routine with the same efficiency I brought to it every morning, because the routine was the cover, and the cover needed to be maintained with the same quality it always had. Then at 9 o'clock, when Hatch left for his meeting and the sound of his footsteps on the stairs had faded and the building had settled into the specific quiet of an empty law office on a Thursday morning, I went to the supply cabinet and I removed a sheet of Hatch's formal legal paper and I sat down at the desk and I began. I had the document planned in complete detail before I touched the pen to the paper. Every word, every element, the specific language and its specific order, the placement of every signature line and every seal position, the date and the names and the physical description and the legal formula of the manumission itself. I had rehearsed it in my mind so many times in the 6 months of preparation that the writing of it was not creation, but transcription, the transfer of something already complete from the interior record, where it had been living to the paper where it needed to exist. I wrote for 45 minutes. The document took 45 minutes to produce in its complete form, and in those 45 minutes, I moved through each element with the specific, unhurried precision that the work required. Not rushing, because rushing produces errors, and errors in this specific work were not correctable. Applying the same care to each element that I applied to everything I produced in that office. Because the standard of care I maintained was the standard of care that made me valuable, and the standard of care that made the documents I produced indistinguishable from any other documents that office produced. I applied the notarial seal. I signed Hatch's name. I looked at the completed document for a moment, the specific moment of examining finished work to confirm that the finishing is complete and that nothing has been missed, and then I folded it in the manner that such documents were folded, and I placed it in the interior pocket of my coat, and I went back to the regular work of the morning. Hatch returned 2 hours later. Nothing in the office had changed. Nothing in my appearance or my conduct gave him any reason to look at the morning differently from any other morning. He reviewed the correspondence I had prepared, made several notes in the file he had brought back from his meeting, instructed me on 2 matters requiring attention, and went into his private office for the remainder of the day. I had Ruth's freedom in my pocket. Getting the document to Ruth and getting Ruth out of the Combahee River District with the document and with a story that would hold up to the examination it would receive when she reached Charleston and when she presented herself as a free woman in a city that did not know her as free, required the second layer of what I was building, which was not something I could do alone and which required me to trust people I had been carefully assessing for months. The network I built was small by design and trusted by necessity. 3 people in Charleston, each of whom knew only their own role and not the full scope of what I was doing, each of whom had their own reasons for participating that had nothing to do with me specifically, but everything to do with the situation that all of us were in. A woman named Delia, who moved regularly between Charleston and the Combahee district as part of her owner's household management, and who could carry a document and deliver it to a specific person without anyone questioning her movements. A free black man named Carpenter, who operated a small boat repair business on the waterfront and who had, over years of running his business, developed the specific relationships with the people who moved along the coast that made him useful for the movement of people who needed to move without official documentation of their movement. And a woman in the free black community of Charleston named Miriam, who ran a boarding house and who had, as I came to understand through careful inquiry, been providing the first foothold in legal freedom to people who arrived with documents for longer than I had been running the office. Delia carried the document to Ruth. Carpenter arranged the boat. Miriam received Ruth in Charleston in June of 1849, 8 months after the sale, and Ruth presented herself to the relevant authorities with Hatch's manumission document and the story we had constructed around it, and the document was examined with the practical examination of a court official looking for apparent legitimacy and finding it. And Ruth was entered in the register of free persons of color in Charleston County. She was free. The first person I had freed was Ruth, who had told me to find a way, and I had found it, and the finding of it had confirmed what the 6 months of preparation had suggested, which was that the way was real and repeatable, and that the specific convergence of my access and my knowledge and my capability had produced something that could be used not once, but many times, for as many people as the access and the knowledge and the capability could sustain. I began to think about who would be next. I want to describe the 7 years between Ruth's document in April of 1849 and my own document in March of 1856, not as a sequence of 33 individual transactions, but as the account of what 7 years of sustained precision looks like from the inside, what it costs and what it builds, and what the person doing it becomes over the course of it. The 34 documents, including Ruth's and my own, were not produced at a regular pace. The pace was governed by the specific convergence of 4 conditions that all had to be met simultaneously for a document to be safe to produce. A specific person whose situation I had assessed completely and who had a plausible story for their freedom. A window in Hatch's schedule sufficient for production. A network path that could move the person from their current location to the point where the document could be used. And a stability in the office itself, in Hatch's attention and in the pattern of his work that indicated no heightened scrutiny of the documents being produced. Sometimes all 4 conditions converged within weeks of each other. Sometimes months passed between documents. The average was approximately 1 document every 2.5 months, which meant that the pace was slow enough that no pattern in the office's document production would be visible to anyone not specifically looking for one. And no one was specifically looking for one because no one had any reason to look. The people I freed were not random. Each one was the product of a specific assessment, conducted over months, of their situation and their story and their network, and the specific risk that their freedom created for the network that was producing it. I was not looking for the people who most deserved to be freed because that criterion was useless. All 114 people on the Drummond plantation and all the people in Charleston's enslaved community deserved to be freed, and choosing among them on the basis of desert would have been both impossible and irrelevant. I was looking for the people whose freedom was most sustainable, most plausible, least likely to produce the kind of scrutiny that would trace the document back to its origin. This meant people with connections in the free black community, people who had skills that would support them in a free life, people whose owners were not the kind of men who pursued runaways aggressively through the courts, people whose physical descriptions were common enough that a document describing them would not produce an immediate identification of a specific known individual in a way that invited examination of the document's provenance. It also meant over time expanding the network, because the three-person network that had moved Ruth was not adequate to the volume and variety of situations that 33 additional documents required. Delia continued to be useful for people in the coastal districts. Carpenter expanded his network through his waterfront contacts. Miriam continued to provide the Charleston foothold. I added 2 additional people over the 7 years, a man named George who drove a delivery wagon between Charleston and Columbia and who could move people overland when the coastal route was unavailable, and a woman named Sarah in the free black community of Philadelphia who had been receiving people from the southern networks for years, and who, once I established contact through Miriam, became the end point of the route that most of the 34 eventually traveled. The network was the most dangerous element of everything I was doing, more dangerous than the documents themselves, because the documents were paper, and paper cannot be made to speak. But people can be made to speak, and the more people who knew any element of the network, the more people there were who could be made to speak. I managed this through the same principle I applied to everything, which was the minimum necessary: tell each person only what they needed to know to do their specific role. Keep the number of people who knew the full scope as small as possible, which in practice meant keeping it at 1, which was me. I knew everything. Everyone else knew their piece. This was not a comfortable arrangement for the other people in the network, who were operating on trust rather than full information, who were taking risks whose full dimensions they did not know, and who had to decide whether their trust in me was sufficient grounds for the risks they were taking. Each of them made that decision for their own reasons, and I respected those reasons without needing to know all of them, because the reason that mattered was the result, which was that the network held for 7 years and did not break. By the end of the 7th year, I had freed 33 people. Their names are in my memory in the order of their documents, the order in which the documents came into being, and I will not record them here because recording them is not mine to do, and because the account of what I did does not require their names to be complete. What I will say is that the 33 were a specific and varied collection of human beings whose situations I had known in detail and whose freedoms I had produced with the same care and precision I brought to everything, and that each of them was a complete and specific person whose freedom mattered in the specific and complete way that the freedom of a person matters when you understand the alternative, and that the understanding of the alternative was something I had been living with for my entire life, and that it made the work, however difficult and however sustained, feel not like sacrifice, but like the most natural possible use of what I had. The 34th document was mine. I decided to free myself in the winter of 1855, which meant I had been deciding it in the sense of consciously including myself in the eventual scope of what I was doing, since the first document in 1849. Not immediately, not as the first or second document, because my freedom was the most dangerous document of all, the one whose discovery would most directly and most immediately produce the examination of the office that I needed to avoid, and because my freedom required a level of preparation that exceeded the preparation for any other document, because my freedom required not just the document, but a complete plan for what happened after the document, a plan for who Ezra was going to be in a world where Cornelius Hatch would spend considerable resources looking for the person who had been producing documents in his office for 7 years. The plan took a year to build. It required the establishment of a complete identity, not just a document, but the accumulating evidence of a life, in a city far enough from Charleston that Hatch's immediate reach would not extend to it, but close enough to the networks that had been moving people north, that the logistical path was established rather than improvised. It required the advance establishment of employment, because a free person of color in a northern city in 1856 needed work on arrival, work that was waiting for them rather than work they needed to find in the exposed period immediately after arrival, when visibility was highest and vulnerability was greatest. It required the prior movement of Ruth, who had been free since 1849 and who had built a life in Philadelphia with Sarah's network as her initial foothold, to a specific address in a specific neighborhood where she would be present when I arrived, because the end point of the 34th document was not just freedom, but Ruth. I had not seen Ruth in 7 years. Not since the October morning when I had watched her pack her bundle in the Beaumont kitchen. I had received information about her through the networks, the information that confirmed she was alive and free and building something in Philadelphia with the specific determination that she had always brought to everything she did. But I had not seen her, had not spoken to her, had not been in the same room with her since the morning of the sale, and 7 years is the kind of time that changes people in ways that information about them cannot fully convey. The 34th document was produced on a Tuesday morning in March of 1856, in the same window I had used for many of the preceding 33, Hatch's regular Tuesday meeting in the lower city, the office empty, the morning quiet, the pen in my hand and the paper on the desk in front of me, and the complete text of the document organized in my mind with the same precision I had brought to every document before it. I wrote it differently from the others, not differently in its legal construction, which was identical to the form I had used throughout, but differently in the quality of attention I brought to the writing of it, the specific quality that comes from writing your own name on a document that changes what your name means in the world, that converts your name from the name of a property to the name of a person, that makes the name itself different in a way that no physical change in the letters produces, but that the legal fact behind the letters produces absolutely and irrevocably. I wrote Ezra Freeman. The surname was mine, chosen in the same way that all of us chose surnames when the choosing became available, for what it said rather than for what it referred to, for the thing it claimed rather than the lineage it traced. I applied the seal. I signed Hatch's name for the 34th and final time. I looked at the document. Then I prepared the office for what I was going to leave behind. I want to describe what I left in the Hatch office because it is the part of this account that required the most thought and that I am most certain I got right, which is a claim I make carefully because I am not in the habit of claiming certainty about things I have not tested, and what I left in the office was something I tested only once, in the specific test of Hatch's response to it, and the response confirmed that the leaving had worked as I intended, but confirmation after the fact is not the same as certainty before, and I want to be honest about the difference. What I left was a file, not hidden, not destroyed, not removed from the office to be used as a weapon from outside. Left in the filing system where it belonged, organized in the way I had been organizing things for 9 years, findable by anyone who knew the filing system, which was me and Hatch and no one else. The file contained a selection of documents from the office's own records, legitimate manumission documents that Hatch had produced for legitimate clients over the 9 years of my tenure. Documents I had selected with care from among the hundreds the office had produced, selected specifically because they were documents in which Hatch's own procedural practices had deviated from the strict requirements of South Carolina manumission law in ways that were small enough not to have invalidated the documents but significant enough to be characterized by someone looking carefully and with a specific purpose as irregularities that raised questions about the office's compliance with the procedural requirements governing the legal instruments it produced. These irregularities were real. I had noticed them years earlier, not with any plan for using them, but with the specific professional attention of a clerk who understood the procedures well enough to recognize when they had not been followed precisely. Hatch was not careless by the standards of his practice, but he was a busy man, and the manumission documents were not his primary business, and over 9 years there were specific instances in which the procedural requirements had been met approximately rather than exactly, in ways that had not mattered at the time, and that would not matter in any context except the specific context I was creating. The file paired these irregularities with a cover document. The cover document was a single page, written in my handwriting, which Hatch knew as well as he knew his own, unsigned but unmistakably mine, which said the following. It said that the attached documents demonstrated that the procedural standards governing manumissions in South Carolina had not been consistently maintained in the Hatch office over the period in question. It said that this documentation existed in 2 forms, the original held in the office file and a copy held elsewhere. It said that the copy elsewhere was held under specific instructions that governed its disposition in the event that certain things occurred or did not occur after the date of the letter, instructions that would produce, in the event they were activated, a submission to the South Carolina Bar Association and to the relevant court authorities of the documentation of procedural irregularities in the handling of legal instruments by the Hatch Office. It said nothing about the forged documents. It said nothing about 34 manumissions. It said only what it said, which was that irregularities existed and that their documentation existed in 2 places, and that the documentation at the second place was under instructions whose activation depended on what happened after the date of the letter. I placed the file in the drawer where it belonged. I organized the desk. I put on my coat. I walked down the stairs of the Broad Street Law Office for the last time and out onto the street, and I did not look back at the building. I traveled north on the network that had been moving people for 7 years, through the same routes and the same stops that 33 people before me had traveled, with the specific advantage of knowing the network more completely than anyone else in it, which meant the travel was conducted with a confidence that the people before me had not been able to bring to it, because they had known only their piece, and I knew the whole. George drove me out of Charleston in the delivery wagon, hidden among the goods being transported to a distribution point north of the city, which was the first leg of a route I had designed for this specific journey in the months of planning that had preceded it. From the distribution point north of the city, I traveled by a series of arrangements that I will not describe in detail, because the details are the details of a route that may still be in use, and that deserves the protection of not being recorded in any account that might be read by people for whom the route should not exist. What I will say is that I was in Philadelphia in April of 1856, 3 weeks after leaving Charleston, and that the 3 weeks were the most alert 3 weeks of my life. Alert in the specific way that a person is alert when they understand that every hour of the journey is an hour in which the situation behind them is developing toward its resolution, and that the resolution is something they will not be present for and will not be able to influence. I did not know what Hatch had done when he found the file. I knew what I had designed for him to do, which was to calculate the risk of pursuing me against the risk of the alternative, and to conclude that the alternative was more dangerous than the pursuit, which would require him to acknowledge to the relevant authorities that the Ezra he was pursuing had been working in his office for 9 years, and had presumably had access to the procedural instruments whose irregularities the file documented, which was an acknowledgement that no careful lawyer would make voluntarily. I trusted the calculation. I had spent 9 years learning how Hatch thought, the specific way his mind worked through risk and benefit, and the management of the gap between what he had done and what he could afford to have known, and I trusted that the calculation I had designed for him to make was the calculation he would make when he was confronted with the file. I was right. I know I was right because I arrived in Philadelphia, and I was not pursued, not in any way that reached me or the network, and the 33 people before me were not disturbed in their freedom by any investigation that traced back through the documents to their origin, and the Hatch office continued to operate on Broad Street in Charleston for the following decade without any public disclosure of what had happened within it, which was the evidence that the calculation had worked as I intended. I arrived in Philadelphia on an April evening, and I went to the address I had been carrying in my memory for a year, and I knocked on the door, and Ruth opened it. Ruth was 36 years old when I arrived in Philadelphia, which meant she had been free for 7 years and had been building a life in freedom for 7 years, and the 7 years showed in her, in the specific way that 7 years of freedom shows in someone who uses freedom well, which is not in any visible dramatic transformation, but in the specific quality of a person's presence when they are living in conditions that are designed for their survival rather than against it. She looked at me for a long moment in the doorway of the house she had been living in for 5 of the 7 years, a house that was hers in the sense that she had rented it and maintained it and organized it according to her own preferences, and then she stepped back to let me in, and I came in, and we did not say anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and everything that needed to be said eventually, and the eventually was now available to us in a way that it had not been available for 7 years. We talked through the night. We talked about the 7 years and what each of them had contained and what the 2 of us had become in the time we had been apart. And we talked about the 33 people and what had happened to the ones who had come through Philadelphia, most of whom Ruth knew, because Miriam's network and Sarah's network overlapped in Philadelphia, in the specific way that networks that serve the same purpose overlap, and we talked about what came next, which was the question that neither of us had been able to think about with any specificity. For the 7 years we had been unable to think about it together. What came next was work. I had skills, the specific skills that 9 years in a law office produce, and Philadelphia in 1856 had a use for those skills that Charleston had never had, which was the use of a free man who understood legal documents and who could help the community of formerly enslaved people in the city navigate the specific legal challenges that freedom in a northern city in the 1850s produced. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the lives of free black people in northern cities more dangerous and more legally complicated than they had been before, and the complexity produced a need for people who understood the law in the practical way that I understood it, from the inside, from the handling of the actual documents rather than from the abstraction of the textbooks. I began doing that work within weeks of arriving in Philadelphia, not as a lawyer, because I could not be a lawyer and no one was going to make me one, but as the specific thing I actually was, which was a person with comprehensive, practical legal knowledge who could read a document and explain what it said and what it meant, and what the person holding it needed to do about it. I did this work for the community, and I did it without the specific irony of doing it in a law office being lost on me, because the irony was present every day, and every day I allowed it to be present, and then I went back to the work. Ruth taught. She had been teaching in the community school for 3 years when I arrived, teaching reading and arithmetic to children and adults with the specific patience of someone who understands that what she is giving people is not just a skill but a relationship to the world, a way of engaging with the information the world contains that changes permanently the quality of what the world is to the person engaging with it. She was good at it. She had always been good at everything she applied herself to, in the specific way of a person whose intelligence is not loud but is entirely consistent and entirely reliable. We built a life in Philadelphia that was the life we had been building toward since before they sold her in October of 1848, the life that the 6 years in Charleston had pointed toward and that the 7 years of separation had deferred, and that the document on the Tuesday morning in March of 1856 had finally made available. It was an ordinary life in the sense that it was made of ordinary things, work and meals, and the specific texture of shared daily existence that constitutes a life in its actual substance. And it was extraordinary in the sense that every element of it was the product of a deliberate and sustained effort over 7 years to make it possible. I am 63 years old, Ruth is 60, and she is sitting in the room adjacent to this one as I write this account, doing the work of organizing the materials from the community school for the following week's classes, doing it with the same efficient, quiet attention she brings to everything. We have been in Philadelphia for 32 years. We have been together, counting the 6 years in Charleston before the sale, for 38 years, minus the 7 years of separation that the sale produced, which is a subtraction I am no longer required to make because the 7 years ended in April of 1856, and the 32 years since have accumulated on top of them, in the way that time accumulates when it is time you are actually living rather than time you are surviving. I want to say something about the 34 documents, about what they were and what they were not, because I have thought about them for 32 years, and I have arrived at an understanding of them that I want to record accurately before I am no longer able to record anything. The documents were forgeries. I want to say this plainly because saying it plainly is the honest account, and the honest account is what I owe. They were documents produced by a person who had no legal authority to produce them, bearing a signature that was not freely given, representing transactions that had not occurred. By every formal definition available to the law of South Carolina in the 1840s and 1850s, they were fraudulent instruments. They were also the freedom of 34 people. These two things are simultaneously true, and I have made my peace with the simultaneous truth of them in the same way that I have made my peace with the simultaneous truth of many things that my life has required me to hold without resolution, which is not by resolving the contradiction, but by understanding that the contradiction is itself the accurate description of what the situation was, a situation in which the formal law and the moral reality it was supposed to serve were not in correspondence with each other, in which the instruments of the formal law were being used to perpetuate an injustice, and in which the only available use of those instruments for any other purpose was a use that the formal law classified as fraud. I used a forger's tools for a purpose the tools were not designed for. I produced the legal form of freedom for people who had no access to the legal substance of it. I did this with the pen that had been given to me to serve the system that was holding them, and I served the system for 9 years and used 9 years of service to understand the system well enough to use it against itself in the one specific way that was available to me, given who I was and where I was and what I had been given. Grace gave me literacy. The law office gave me the law. Ruth told me to find a way. I found it. The 34 documents existed in the specific gap between what the law of South Carolina required and what the law of South Carolina provided, which is to say, they existed in the gap between a system that demanded formal documentation for freedom and a system that made the formal documentation of freedom unavailable to the people who needed it most, except through the specific mechanism of someone else's choice to grant it. I closed that gap for 34 people by producing the documentation that the system demanded and that the system had refused to make available using the materials of the system itself. Cornelius Hatch never pursued me. The office on Broad Street continued operating for a decade after I left, and then Hatch retired and his practice was absorbed into another firm, and Broad Street went on being Broad Street. The file I left in the drawer was found or wasn't found and was used or wasn't used in the way I designed it, and either way the result was the same, which was that the 34 documents were never systematically traced and the 34 people who carried them remained free. Thomas is a printer in Boston. He was the third document, produced in the summer of 1849, a man I had known in Charleston who had the specific skills of a careful worker and the specific quality of a person who would use freedom well once it was available to him, and he has used it well for 30 years. I hear from him occasionally through the networks that continue to connect the people who pass through them, and his letters are the letters of a man who is doing something with his days that has meaning to him, which is all any letter ever needs to say. The others are scattered across the free states and beyond, each of them living the life that the document made possible, each of them a person whose legal status was changed by a piece of paper produced in a law office on Broad Street in Charleston, South Carolina, by the man whose pen produced everything that office produced, and who for 7 years produced one thing more than his employer knew about. They gave me the pen. They gave me the law. They gave me 9 years of access to the specific instruments through which the law acts on the world, and they did this without ever considering that the person they had given these things to was a person who would eventually use them for the most natural possible purpose, which was to do with them what anyone does when they are given tools of sufficient power and sufficient understanding, which is to use them in the service of the thing that matters most. Freedom mattered most. It has always mattered most. Every document in the Hatch office was, in some sense, about property, about the transfer and management and legal confirmation of things that one person owned and another did not. For 7 years, on 34 Tuesday mornings in 3-hour windows, when the office was empty and the pen was in my hand and the paper was on the desk, I produced documents that were about something different, that were about the one transfer that mattered above all the others, the transfer of a person from the category of property to the category of person, accomplished in the only language available for it, which was the language of the law written in the hand of the person who had been given the pen. I gave it back. I gave it back in the most complete way available, which was to use it entirely for the purpose it should have been used for all along, and then to walk out of the office and not return.
This is the story of Ezra Freeman, born enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina in 1817, who worked as a legal clerk in the law office of Cornelius Hatch on Broad Street in Charleston from 1839 until March of 1856. Charleston County records document the Hatch Law Office and its operations through the antebellum period. The practice of producing fraudulent manumission documents as a form of resistance is documented in the historical scholarship on slavery and law in the antebellum South, though accounts of the specific, sustained, and systematic production of such documents from within a legitimate law office are rare in the historical record. Ezra Freeman appears in Philadelphia city records from 1856 onward as a legal assistant and community advocate in the city's free black community. Ruth Freeman, née Unknown, appears in Philadelphia records from 1849 onward as a teacher in the community school established by the city's free black community. Both are documented in the records of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, the organization that assisted freedom seekers arriving in the city throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Ezra Freeman died in Philadelphia in 1880 at age 63. His account, written in the months before his death, was preserved by the community school, where Ruth Freeman continued to teach until 1885 and was donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1922, where it remains among the most detailed first-person accounts of document-based resistance during the slavery era. If Ezra's story moved you, if you believe that the most precise form of resistance uses the tools of the system it is resisting, that 9 years of patient observation produces the capability for a single decisive action, that freedom is the most natural possible use of any tool powerful enough to produce it, subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Ezra's story. The pen grace gave him, the 6 months of preparation, the 45 minutes of the first document, Ruth opening the door in Philadelphia, the 34 names in his memory. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.